Somewhere off the coast of Norway, on the 4th of May 1945, a German submarine commander looked through his periscope at a British warship close enough to sink with a single torpedo. He held his fire. Hours earlier, he had received the order that ended the war beneath the waves. What he claimed happened next, a silent, undetected approach on an enemy cruiser, has been argued over by historians for decades. Was it true, or was it the last piece of pride a defeated navy allowed itself to keep? That submarine, U-2511, was the most advanced weapon of its kind ever built, a machine so far ahead of its time that the men who captured it could not stop staring at it. But being the best did not save it. Within months, it would be dragged out into a winter storm and sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, one of over 100 U-boats marked for destruction, in a secret operation the Allies never wanted the public to see. This is the story of what happened to Hitler's undersea fleet after the guns went silent, and why some of the deadliest machines of the war ended up forgotten in the mud, while others became monuments to the men who never came home. The North Sea in early May 1945 was a cold, gray world of fog and low cloud, the kind of weather that swallowed ships whole and gave submarines their only real advantage: invisibility. Beneath that fog, off the coast of Bergen, Norway, a single German U-boat moved through the water without a sound, its electric motors humming just above silence. Inside the narrow steel hull, 40-odd men breathed recycled air thick with diesel oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that never really left a submarine, no matter how many patrols a crew survived. This was U-2511, the newest and most dangerous submarine in the world, and at its command stood a 31-year-old officer named Adalbert Schnee. Schnee was not a young man discovering war for the first time. Born in Berlin at the end of 1913, he had spent nearly 8 years in the U-boat arm, rising from a young watch officer to one of Germany's most decorated commanders. He had sunk 21 Allied merchant ships and 2 Royal Navy vessels across 7 brutal patrols in the Atlantic, earning the Knight's Cross and later the Oak Leaves that marked him as one of the Kriegsmarine's elite. By 1945, most of the men who had started the U-boat war alongside him were dead. The average U-boat sailor in the Battle of the Atlantic had roughly even odds of returning home, and those odds had grown worse every year since 1943, when Allied radar, sonar, and long-range aircraft turned the ocean from a hunting ground into a graveyard. Schnee had survived where so many had not, and in September 1944, he was given command of something the Allies had never encountered before. U-2511 was a Type 21, what the Germans called an electroboot, an electric boat. Unlike every U-boat that came before it, the Type 21 was not a surface vessel that could occasionally submerge to attack. It was designed from its first rivet to live beneath the water, propelled by battery banks so large they took up nearly half the hull, capable of running silent and fast at depths and speeds no Allied sonar operator had trained to expect. It could cross the Atlantic almost entirely submerged. Its hull was smooth and hydrodynamic, stripped of the deck guns and clutter that made older U-boats easy to spot on radar. Engineers on both sides of the war would later agree that had the Type 21 arrived 2 years earlier, it might have changed the entire course of the naval war in the Atlantic. It did not arrive 2 years earlier. It arrived in the last winter of a war that Germany had already lost. On the 3rd of May 1945, U-2511 slipped out of Bergen Harbor for its first and only combat patrol, bound for the warm waters of the Caribbean, where Schnee hoped to find American shipping still unaware of just how advanced this new machine truly was. He would never get the chance. The war he had spent nearly 6 years fighting was, by then, only hours from its end. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets the day before. Adolf Hitler had been dead by his own hand for 3 days. The man now nominally in charge of what remained of the German state was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, himself a former U-boat commander, the architect of the Wolfpack tactics that had once terrorized Allied convoys and the man who now had to preside over the final collapse of the navy he had built. On the 4th of May, less than 24 hours after leaving port, Schnee's radio crackled with the message every U-boat commander in the Atlantic had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The order was simple, almost administrative in its wording, utterly seismic in what it meant. All U-boats were to cease hostilities immediately, surface, hoist a black flag or pennant as a sign of surrender, and proceed to the nearest Allied port under the terms Dönitz had accepted. The undersea war that had cost more than 100,000 lives, German and Allied combined, was over in the space of a single radio transmission. What happened in the hours immediately after Schnee received that order has never been fully settled, and it says something important about how history and legend blur together in wartime, especially when the only witness to an event is the man who has every reason to tell it in the most flattering light. Schnee himself later claimed that in the moments before he broke off his patrol, he brought U-2511 in close, undetected, to a group of British warships, closing to within 500 meters of the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk. He said he lined up what would have been an unstoppable attack, a demonstration of exactly what the Type 21 could do against an enemy that never saw it coming, and then, honoring the ceasefire, quietly withdrew without firing a single torpedo. It became one of the most repeated stories of the U-boat war's final days, a tale of a defeated navy's last flash of pride. There is a problem with that story, and it is worth stating plainly rather than repeating the legend as fact. Decades later, researchers who reconstructed the timeline of that day using the position logs of both vessels concluded that the two ships likely could not have been in the same waters at the same time. The encounter, as dramatic as it sounds, may never have happened at all, or may have happened in a far less cinematic form than Schnee described. It is impossible now to know for certain whether he was describing a real moment of extraordinary restraint, embellishing a smaller, less remarkable event, or simply repeating a story that had already begun to take on a life of its own among former U-boat crews eager for something to be proud of in a war that had ended in total defeat. What can be said honestly is that Schnee turned his submarine around, obeyed the ceasefire, and brought his crew home without firing another shot. The rest belongs to the uncertain space between memory and myth that surrounds so much of this war. Whatever happened off Bergen that day, U-2511 turned back and surfaced, its gray conning tower breaking the surface of the North Sea for what would be the last time under a German flag. It was, in its own way, a small and almost quiet ending for a machine that had been built with such extraordinary ambition. Across the length of the Atlantic and the fjords of occupied Norway, the same scene was repeating itself aboard more than 150 other U-boats. Exhausted crews who had spent the war hunting in the dark now stood on their own decks in daylight, hands raised, white flags and black surrender pennants snapping in the wind, while Allied aircraft circled low overhead to make certain the surrender was real and not another trap. They came in from every direction. Boats that had been patrolling off the coast of Ireland turned east. Boats hiding in the deep Norwegian fjords, where Allied bombers had never quite managed to reach them, emerged into ports many of their crews had never expected to see again, except as prisoners. They sailed toward assembly points the Allies had designated weeks in advance, ports whose names would become permanently associated with the death of the U-boat fleet: Loch Eriboll on the wild northern coast of Scotland, Lissahallie on the River Foyle in Northern Ireland, and Portland on England's southern shore. Each arrival was small in itself, one more gray hull easing into a harbor under armed escort, yet together they marked the total, final collapse of a fleet that had once come close to starving Britain into surrender. The process the Allies had designed for receiving these surrenders was deliberately rigid, almost clinical, a stark contrast to the chaos of the war that had just ended. Royal Navy and American destroyers met the U-boats far out at sea and escorted them in, refusing to let any submarine approach a harbor unguarded. Boarding parties came aboard the moment a U-boat was secured, and their orders were specific: Seize the codebooks, seize the charts, seize the weapons, and above all, seize anything that might reveal the technical secrets these machines still carried. Engineers moved through hulls that reeked of diesel fuel and unwashed men, cataloging torpedo tubes, listening equipment, and the revolutionary battery systems that had made boats like U-2511 possible. Many of the surrendered vessels were barely fit to float, their hulls streaked with rust, their crews thin and hollow-eyed after months at sea with dwindling supplies and no safe harbor to return to. At Loch Erebol, the scene was almost apocalyptic in scale. Nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in the grey Scottish loch, a silent, motionless fleet that had once been scattered across 3 oceans, now crowded into a single stretch of water, watched over by Royal Navy warships and reporters brought in to photograph what remained of Hitler's undersea war machine. The logistics alone were staggering. Tugs and escort vessels had to track down and secure submarines scattered from the coast of France to the Arctic waters off Norway, towing some that could no longer make the journey under their own power. Not every U-boat made it. A handful were scuttled by their own crews rather than surrendered, their captains choosing to send their boats to the bottom themselves instead of watching them towed away as trophies. Others simply broke down and sank on the way, victims of mechanical failure after years of hard use, and in many cases, months of deferred maintenance that no dockyard in occupied Germany had been able to provide. For the men who had fought this war beneath the waves, the surrender brought no immediate relief, only a different kind of uncertainty. Some were pulled aside almost as soon as they stepped off their boats, singled out by intelligence officers who wanted to know everything about engine specifications, torpedo guidance systems, and the training behind Germany's newest and most dangerous submarines. Others were simply marched into holding camps, given little explanation of what would happen to them next, left to wonder whether they would be treated as prisoners of war, as war criminals, or as something in between. Most would spend the rest of 1945 in Allied custody, questioned in fragments, before being released back into a Germany that barely resembled the country they had left years earlier, a nation now divided, occupied, and struggling simply to feed itself. By the final weeks of 1945, the harbors of Britain, from Trondheim's temporary holding anchorages to the crowded docks of Portsmouth, were clogged with the largest collection of submarines the world had ever seen gathered in one place. 156 U-boats had surrendered in total, a fleet that had once ranged across every ocean touched by the war, now reduced to rows of silent gray hulls rusting quietly at anchor, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. For Adalbert Schnee and the crew of U-2511, that decision, when it finally came, would prove far less kind than anything they might have imagined as they surfaced off the coast of Norway, obedient to the last, on the 4th of May, 1945. By the late summer of 1945, the Allied leadership faced a problem that no naval planner had ever had to solve at this scale before. 156 German submarines sat crowded in British and Northern Irish harbors, their crews dispersed into camps, their fuel tanks slowly drained, their hulls rusting in the salt air. Some of these boats were obsolete relics of a war that had already moved past them. Others, like Adalbert Schnee's U-2511, represented a leap in submarine design so significant that naval engineers in Washington, London, and Moscow were already arguing over who deserved to study them first. Keeping 156 warships afloat indefinitely was not simply expensive. It was strategically dangerous, a fleet of unknown reliability sitting in crowded harbors, manned by skeleton crews from a defeated nation, at the exact moment the wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was beginning to fracture into something colder and far more suspicious. The solution came in 2 parts, and the split between them would decide the fate of every single U-boat that had survived the war. In August 1945, the victorious powers formed what became known as the Tripartite Naval Commission, a joint body representing the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, tasked with dividing the surrendered fleet among the 3 nations. It was, on paper, a technical exercise in fair distribution. In practice, it was one of the earliest visible fractures of the coming Cold War. Three former allies sitting across a table from one another, each trying to claim the largest possible share of Nazi Germany's most advanced military technology before the others could get their hands on it. The Commission's arithmetic was simple. Each of the three powers would receive 10 U-boats for detailed examination, with priority given to the two most advanced classes ever built, the Type 21 and the smaller Type 10X NU. These were the Electroboot, the electric boats, submarines built to fight primarily underwater rather than on the surface, with streamlined hulls, enormous battery capacity, and snorkel systems that let them run their diesel engines while submerged, recharging without ever having to fully surface into the sights of Allied aircraft. 30 boats, then, would be preserved, at least for a while, spared from destruction so that engineers in 3 different countries could take them apart piece by piece and learn everything the Kriegsmarine had discovered in the final desperate years of the war. The remaining 116 submarines, the older, less advanced, or simply less useful vessels, were given a very different fate. They were marked for destruction. A further small number of boats, outside the tripartite formula entirely, would eventually be handed to smaller Allied navies rebuilding their own fleets, rounding out what happened to the full surrendered force of 156. The negotiations behind that division were not friendly. British and American naval officers, sitting across the table from their Soviet counterparts only months after the guns had gone quiet, understood perfectly well that they were no longer just dividing scrap metal from a defeated enemy. They were setting a precedent for how the emerging Cold War would handle captured technology, and neither side wanted to be the one that came away with less than its fair share of Germany's most advanced engineering. Meetings that were supposed to be routine and administrative stretched on as each delegation pressed for access to specific hulls, specific blueprints, specific engineers who had worked on the Type 21 program. The submarines themselves, silent and rusting in their harbors, had no idea they were already being fought over by the very nations that had spent 6 years trying to destroy them. The plan to destroy them had a name that sounded almost peaceful, almost administrative, the kind of quiet bureaucratic label that hides an enormous undertaking behind a few syllables. It was called Operation Deadlight. The concept was straightforward. Royal Navy tugs would take the condemned U-boats, tow them roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland into 3 designated dumping areas the Admiralty had labeled simply XX, YY, and ZZ, and there, in open Atlantic water far from shipping lanes and prying eyes, the boats would be sunk. Some would go down by naval gunfire. Others would be sent under by explosive charges placed inside their hulls. A few, the simplest and least dramatic method of all, would be sunk by nothing more than opening their own sea valves and letting the Atlantic pour in until the pressure hulls that had once protected their crews from the crushing depths of the ocean instead dragged them down into it. Operation Deadlight began in earnest in November 1945, and from its very first week, it became clear that the operation would be far messier and far more dangerous than anyone in the Admiralty had planned for. Many of the condemned submarines were in genuinely dreadful physical condition. Some had spent their final months of the war running on fumes and improvised repairs, their crews too exhausted and too short on parts to properly maintain hulls that had been designed for a much shorter operational life than the war had actually demanded of them. Ballast tanks leaked. Diesel engines, run for months without proper servicing, seized entirely. Hulls that had absorbed the shock of depth charges and near misses throughout the war were now thin with rust in places no shipyard had inspected in years. Towing dozens of these unstable, half-dead machines across some of the roughest winter seas in the North Atlantic was, in hindsight, close to reckless. The tug crews assigned to Deadlight were, for the most part, ordinary Royal Navy sailors who had spent the war escorting convoys or hunting the very submarines they were now being asked to drag out to sea and sink. There was little glory in the assignment. It meant long, freezing days on open decks, monitoring tow cables in the dark, watching a dead hulk wallow behind them in swells tall enough to bury the U-boat's own conning tower from view. No German crew remained aboard these boats during their final journey. The men who had once sailed them were by then hundreds of miles away and holding camps, waiting on news of their own fate, with no way of knowing exactly when or how the machines they had commanded for years would finally go under. For many of them, the end of their submarines was something they would only learn about secondhand, weeks or months later, a brief line in a report, rather than a moment they were present to witness. The weather that winter made a difficult task nearly impossible. Storm after storm rolled through the waters northwest of Ireland, the same brutal Atlantic conditions that had sunk Allied convoys throughout the war, now turning on the U-boats that had once hunted them. Tow cables, under enormous strain and heavy swells, snapped without warning. Submarines with no crew aboard to correct a listing hull or pump out a flooding compartment had no way to save themselves once something went wrong. The result was a level of loss that surprised even the naval officers overseeing the operation. Of the 116 U-boats condemned to deadlight, 56 never reached their assigned dumping zones at all. They foundered in transit, dragged under by the same storms that made the operation so hazardous for the tugs and skeleton crews trying to manage them, sinking in places the Royal Navy had never intended and, in most cases, never bothered to chart precisely. The purpose of deadlight was destruction, not preservation, and once a boat went down in a storm rather than in a designated dumping zone, no one saw much reason to spend further resources finding out exactly where it had come to rest. Among the vessels that did reach their intended end was U-2336, a submarine whose story carried a strange kind of historical weight. It had fired the torpedoes that sank the last Allied merchant ships lost to U-boat action anywhere in the war, a grim distinction earned in the very final days of the fighting, just hours before Germany's surrender took full effect. U-2336 surrendered at Lisahalli in June 1945, along with dozens of other boats, and in January 1946 it was towed out and deliberately sent to the bottom off the Irish coast. The submarine that had claimed the war's last victims, now claimed by the peace that followed. Another vessel, U-295, met a similar end on the 17th of December 1945, towed out from Loch Ryan in Scotland, and scuttled according to plan. One more gray hull added to what was quietly becoming one of the largest underwater graveyards in naval history. It would be reasonable to assume that a machine as advanced as U-2511, Schnee's Type Tensi 1, would have been near the very top of the list for preservation and study. It was, after all, exactly the kind of submarine the Tripartite Commission had been formed to protect and examine. Yet U-2511 was not among the 30 boats chosen for the American, British, or Soviet research programs. For reasons the historical record does not fully explain, perhaps its condition, perhaps simple administrative chance, perhaps the sheer number of Type 21 hulls already available elsewhere for study, Schnee's submarine was instead assigned to the deadlight destruction list, along with the older, less remarkable boats it had been designed to outclass. On the 2nd of January 1946, U-2511 was taken under tow from Lisahalli toward Moville, further up the coast, where it would be prepared for scuttling like so many boats before it. 5 days later, on the 7th of January, a heavy winter storm caught the tow. The strain proved too much for the cable, and it parted, leaving the empty submarine adrift and unmanageable in open water. Royal Navy vessels standing by did not attempt to recover the tow. Instead, at 1940 hours that evening, they opened fire, and the most advanced submarine ever built by Nazi Germany, the boat that Adalbert Schnee had once believed might approach an enemy cruiser, unseen and undetected, sank beneath naval gunfire in the cold water off the northern Irish coast, a little more than 60 meters down, not as a calculated final act closing out a historic operation, but as the practical, almost anticlimactic result of a snapped cable in a winter gale. There is something worth sitting with in that ending, The machine that German engineers believed could have turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, had it arrived only a year or two earlier, did not end its life in a laboratory being carefully disassembled by curious Allied scientists, nor in a moment of ceremony marking the symbolic close of the U-boat war. It ended adrift in a storm, sunk almost as an afterthought, no more dignified in death than the aging, worn-out boats it had been built to replace. War does not always grant its most remarkable creations remarkable endings. Schnee himself was not aboard when it happened. Like the rest of his crew, he had long since been separated from his boat, held and questioned by Allied intelligence officers eager to understand exactly what the Type 21 could do and how close Germany had come to building an entire fleet of them. Whatever pride he had carried away from that disputed encounter off Bergen in the war's final hours, he would have learned of his submarine's actual end, the same way most former U-boat commanders learned of their vessels' fates that winter, in a brief report passed along months after the fact, describing a storm, a snapped cable, and a few rounds of naval gunfire in the dark. It was a strangely quiet epitaph for a machine that German propaganda had once promised would save the war. While U-2511 went down off Ireland, the 30 boats selected by the Tripartite Commission were living out a very different story, one that would shape submarine design for the next several decades. In Britain, the Royal Navy took a close interest in several captured Type 21 and Type 10 hulls. One of them, U-317, was formally taken into Royal Navy service under a new name, HMS N-41. British crews ran the vessel through submerged trials and endurance tests, measuring its underwater speed and its battery endurance against the standards of their own wartime submarines, before the boat was finally scrapped in 1949, once its lessons had been thoroughly absorbed. Other captured hulls were sent to Canadian waters, where a submarine that had surrendered off Newfoundland, U-190, was taken into Canadian naval service not to fight but to train. Canadian sonar operators and torpedo crews used the German boat as a live practice target and platform, learning to hunt the very kind of machine that had once hunted Allied shipping across the Atlantic. The Royal Navy also used several of the retained hulls in a more brutal fashion, detonating depth charges near their real German steel to refine detonation depths and blast patterns, data that mock targets built from scratch simply could not provide with the same accuracy. The Americans pursued their share of the fleet with equal seriousness. Captured submarines were shipped to naval facilities at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and New London, Connecticut, where engineers and submarine crews from the United States Navy studied propulsion systems, listening equipment, and the periscope designs that had made German boats so effective at approaching targets undetected. Much of what American engineers learned from these examinations would quietly influence the design of the first generation of American submarines built after the war, vessels that inherited more from their former enemies' engineering than most of their crews would ever be told. No single captured submarine attracted more American attention than U-234, and for good reason. It was not a combat U-boat in the traditional sense, but a long-range transport submarine, one of the largest in the German fleet, captured on the 14th of May, 1945, off the coast of Newfoundland while attempting to reach Japan, an ally that was, by that point, only 3 months from its own surrender. What made U-234 extraordinary was not its size, but its cargo. Inside its hull, American boarding parties found crates containing uranium oxide, along with components for jet engines, advanced torpedoes, and other technical material Germany had apparently intended to share with its Japanese ally in the war's final desperate months. The exact purpose Germany intended for that uranium, whether for a weapons program, an energy program, or simply as a strategic trade good to secure Japanese cooperation, remains a subject of historical debate rather than settled fact, and it deserves to be treated with that same caution rather than turned into a more dramatic story than the evidence actually supports. What is certain is that American naval intelligence took the cargo seriously enough to study it thoroughly before eventually sinking U-234 during weapons testing in 1947. Its secrets long since extracted. Its usefulness as an experimental target now outweighing its usefulness as a museum piece or a diplomatic curiosity. The capture of U-234 also carried a human dimension that made headlines of its own at the time. Among the passengers aboard were German technical officers and 2 Japanese military attachés being ferried toward Tokyo, men who chose to take their own lives rather than face capture once the submarine's commander realized the war in Europe was over and turned the boat toward American custody instead of continuing east. It was a stark, uncomfortable reminder that even a story built around technology and cargo manifests was, underneath everything else, still a story about people making desperate choices in the last days of a collapsing war. The Soviet Union's share of the captured fleet proved to be the most consequential of all, though its effects would not become fully visible for another decade. Soviet engineers received several of the prized Type 21 hulls and set about the same painstaking process their British and American counterparts were conducting, disassembling German pressure hulls, battery compartments, and snorkel systems to understand exactly how they had been built. Where the British and Americans treated their captured technology largely as a source of incremental improvement to already mature submarine programs, the Soviet Navy used what it learned from the Type 21 as the direct template for an entirely new class of submarine. The result, later known to Western intelligence as the Whiskey class, would become the backbone of the early Soviet submarine fleet, built in numbers that alarmed naval planners in London and Washington precisely because they recognized the German engineering underneath the Soviet paint. The same hydrodynamic hull shapes and underwater endurance that Adalbert Schnee had once commanded off the coast of Norway were, within a few years, patrolling under a different flag entirely, in a new and far colder confrontation that the men who built the Type 21 could scarcely have imagined. For the Western powers watching this unfold, it was an uncomfortable realization. The technology they had helped disperse across 3 nations in the name of orderly post-war administration was now fueling exactly the kind of arms race the Tripartite Commission had never been designed to prevent. Britain and the United States had approached the division of Germany's submarine fleet hoping that shared knowledge might help preserve some measure of balance and cooperation among the wartime allies. Instead, as Soviet shipyards turned German blueprints into a growing fleet of their own, the U-boats had become, without anyone fully intending it, one of the opening chapters of the Cold War beneath the waves. There is a certain grim irony in how completely that outcome contradicted the original purpose of the Tripartite Commission. The entire point of dividing the fleet through a joint Allied body had been to manage Germany's dangerous legacy responsibly, to make sure no single power emerged from the ashes of the U-boat war with an unchecked technological advantage. Instead, the Commission became the mechanism by which that same dangerous legacy was formally handed to a rival superpower, wrapped in the language of fair and equal distribution. Men who had spent the war designing and building U-boats to serve the Third Reich would spend the following decade watching, from a defeated and divided homeland, as their work quietly reshaped the navies of the 2 new global powers now squaring off against each other, a legacy none of them had asked for, and few of them could take any real pride in. Not every captured submarine ended up in the hands of one of the 3 great powers either. Smaller Allied nations, rebuilding their own navies after years of occupation or reduced capacity, received a modest share of the surrendered fleet as well. France, whose own naval forces had been shattered and scattered since 1940, took possession of several U-boats from the broader Allied stockpile. One of them, U-123, a submarine that had fought through much of the Battle of the Atlantic under its original crew, was renamed Blazon and placed into service under the French flag, serving for several years as a working vessel in the rebuilt French Navy rather than being sent to the bottom like so many of its sister boats. Norway, whose fjords had sheltered dozens of U-boats during the war's final months, took several captured vessels into its own service for training and coastal patrol duties, A small irony given how many of those same waters had once hidden German submarines from Allied search aircraft. Denmark, rebuilding its own modest naval capacity, incorporated elements of captured German submarine technology into its post-war shipbuilding programs rather than operating whole vessels itself. By the end of the 1940s, even most of the U-boats that had escaped the immediate deadlight destruction had themselves been quietly retired, scrapped, or deliberately sunk once their intelligence value had been fully exhausted. The active operational lives of these machines, in Allied hands, tended to be short, measured in a handful of years rather than decades. Yet their influence proved far more durable than the hulls themselves. The core innovations of the Type 21, its battery capacity, its streamlined hydrodynamics, its underwater speed and endurance, became the foundation on which nearly every conventional submarine built through the 1950s was designed, regardless of which flag that submarine ultimately flew. In a strange and not entirely comfortable sense, one of Nazi Germany's final and most desperate wartime inventions became the blueprint that carried submarine warfare into the nuclear age that followed, a legacy none of the men who built or captured these machines could have fully anticipated as they stood on rusting decks in Scottish and Irish harbors in the winter of 1945, watching a war's last weapons wait to learn their fate. Not every submarine that surrendered in the spring of 1945 ended its story in a storm off Ireland or a weapons test in open water. A small handful escaped both Operation Deadlight and the disassembly tables of the Tripartite Commission, and their survival, almost accidental in most cases, turned them from weapons of war into something closer to monuments, physical reminders of a war that grew stranger and more complicated the further it receded into memory. The best known of these survivors is U-995, a Type Veik boat that surrendered at Trondheim, Norway, in May 1945, alongside so many others gathering in fjords up and down the Norwegian coast. Rather than being handed to the scrapyard or the scuttling zones, U-995 was taken into the Royal Norwegian Navy, where it served for close to 2 decades under a flag its original builders had never intended for it, training a new generation of Norwegian sailors in the same waters it had once patrolled as an enemy vessel. In 1965, in a gesture that said something about how quickly former enemies had learned to share difficult history rather than simply bury it, Norway returned the submarine to West Germany. Today it rests permanently on land at Labo, near Kiel, beside the towering Marine Ehrenmal Memorial built to honor German sailors lost at sea. Visitors who duck through its narrow hatches and walk its cramped, low-ceilinged passageways step into the same claustrophobic space where roughly 45 men once lived for weeks at a time, sleeping in shifts, breathing air thick with diesel fumes, sharing a handful of bunks between 3 or 4 sailors who worked in rotating watches around the clock. It is one thing to read the tonnage figures and patrol statistics of the U-boat war. It is another to stand inside the actual metal tube where that war was fought and understand, physically, just how little space and how little privacy it allowed the men who fought it. There is no room aboard U-995 that was not built for a purpose. Every pipe, gauge, and valve sits within arm's reach of the next, and the bunks folded into the gaps between torpedo racks remind visitors that even sleep, on a boat like this, was squeezed into whatever space the machinery did not already claim. France's share of the surviving fleet found a different kind of afterlife. U-123, the boat renamed Blazon after entering French service, spent several years as a working vessel in the rebuilt French Navy rather than being scrapped once its intelligence value was exhausted, an unusually long and ordinary career for a submarine that had begun its life hunting Allied shipping under a very different flag. When it was finally retired, the French Navy preserved it at Lorient, once one of the most important U-boat bases the Kriegsmarine had operated anywhere in occupied Europe, its massive concrete submarine pens, too solidly built for Allied bombing to ever fully destroy. There was a particular irony in a former German U-boat spending its retirement inside the very naval infrastructure Germany itself had built to house boats just like it. Other survivors emerged from far stranger circumstances, decades after the war had ended. U-534 had never actually surrendered in the conventional sense. It was sunk on the 5th of May, 1945, by Allied aircraft while attempting to flee north through the Kattegat Strait between Denmark and Sweden in the war's final chaotic hours. Its exact cargo and mission still debated by historians long after the fact. The wreck lay largely forgotten on the seabed for almost half a century, until it was raised in 1993, brought back to the surface after 48 years underwater, and eventually put on public display in Birkenhead, England. There, visitors can walk through the boat's hull, which conservators cut into several cross-sections to let the public see directly into compartments that would otherwise remain sealed, torpedo room, control room, engine spaces, laid open like a diagram brought to life in rusted steel. Nearly half a century of saltwater had done its own quiet work on the hull before it ever reached dry land again, and the corrosion visible in its steel plating tells its own story about how long the wreck sat undisturbed, forgotten by almost everyone except the fishermen, whose nets occasionally snagged on it. The United States preserved its own emblematic reminder of the U-boat war, though this particular submarine's story began well before the general surrender of May 1945. U-505 was captured intact in June 1944, boarded at sea by an American task group off the coast of West Africa in one of the most daring and closely guarded operations of the naval war. Its capture kept secret for months so that Germany would not realize its codebooks and equipment had fallen into American hands. After the war, rather than being scrapped or scuttled like so many of its sister boats, U-505 was eventually transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains today, meticulously restored and maintained, commonly described as the first enemy warship ever put on permanent display on American soil. It draws visitors from across the country who walk its narrow corridors much as visitors do at Labo, coming away with the same quiet, uncomfortable understanding of just how confined and dangerous life aboard these machines really was. The vast majority of Germany's U-boats, however, never became museum pieces at all. They remained exactly where Operation Deadlight had left them, scattered across the seabed in the 3 designated dumping zones northwest of Ireland, along with the 56 boats that had gone down accidentally during the towing operations in the storms of that first winter. For decades, this enormous underwater graveyard sat almost entirely forgotten, marked on Royal Navy charts by little more than coordinates and case numbers, its exact contents and condition unknown to anyone outside a handful of naval archives. That changed between 2001 and 2003, when the maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney led a series of expeditions specifically aimed at rediscovering and cataloging the Deadlight wrecks. Using side-scan sonar and deep-sea photography, McCartney's team identified at least 14 largely intact U-boat hulls resting in the cold, dark mud of the North Atlantic seabed, some still sitting upright as though they had simply settled onto the bottom rather than been sunk by gunfire or explosive charges. The images his team brought back told their own quiet story about how the scuttling operation had actually been carried out under difficult winter conditions. Decks still fitted with deck guns, hatches still sealed, hulls now slowly disappearing under a growing crust of cold water coral and marine growth. It was, in its own way, the closest thing Operation Deadlight ever received to a formal historical audit, 60 years after the operation itself had been carried out largely without public attention, and with no real effort made at the time to record precisely where each boat came to rest. For Adalbert Schnee, the man who had commanded the most advanced of all these vessels, the post-war years unfolded far from any headline or archive. After his release from Allied custody, he did not return to naval service. He worked for a time as a commercial representative, a quiet, unremarkable civilian occupation for a man who had once held one of the most celebrated combat records in the entire U-boat fleet. Later, he became the director of a sailing school on the Italian island of Elba, trading the cramped, dangerous world of submarine warfare for open-water sailing lessons in the Mediterranean sun. For many years afterward, he served as chairman of the Verband der U-Bootsfahrer, the German association representing former U-boat crewmen, a role that put him at the center of how an entire generation of former submariners chose to remember, commemorate, and quietly reckon with what they had done during the war. He died in Hamburg in November 1982, decades removed from the cold morning off Bergen, when he had turned his submarine back toward port, rather than fire on an enemy cruiser he may or may not have actually encountered. None of that, the museum lighting, the polished information placards, the gift shop postcards, can fully recreate what it actually felt like to serve aboard one of these boats during the war itself. The constant low hum of machinery, the condensation dripping from cold steel overhead, the particular silence a crew learned to hold when they heard an enemy destroyer's propellers passing somewhere above them in the dark. That experience belongs entirely to the men who lived it, and most of them are gone now too. The overall human cost behind these machines is easy to lose beneath the technical details of hull types and battery capacities, but it deserves to be stated plainly. More than 30,000 German submariners died during the war, an extraordinarily high casualty rate for any branch of any military in the conflict, alongside a substantial and still less precisely counted number of Allied merchant sailors and naval crews lost to U-boat attacks across 6 years of fighting in the Atlantic, the Arctic convoys, and beyond. The machines that once represented the very edge of stealth and engineering precision now stand, wherever they still exist at all, as something closer to memorials, reminders less of the technology itself than of the men, on every side, who did not come home. Today, the preserved boats at Le Beau, Lorient, Birkenhead, and Chicago, along with the scattered coral-covered wrecks resting off the coast of Ireland, form two very different kinds of monument to the same short and violent chapter of naval history, one above the water where visitors can walk through history with their own hands on the steel, and one below it, silent and largely undisturbed, in the cold, dark water where Operation Deadlight quietly closed the final chapter of Hitler's undersea fleet. Between the boat that Adalbert Schnee once commanded through a Norwegian fjord and the 14 hulls that Innes McCartney's team rediscovered on the ocean floor more than half a century later, lies the entire strange, uneven story of what happens to the weapons of a defeated nation, some destroyed almost by accident, some preserved by chance, and all of them, in the end, outlived by the men who built and sailed them.